There are two basic kinds of studies that you can do when you're trying to gather some statistical data about a possible relationship between two variables. So there's observational studies and experimental studies. In an observational study, the researcher merely observes what is happening or what has happened. In an experimental study, the researcher manipulates one of the variables and tries to determine how the manipulation influences other variables. So what that means is, well, let's say you were trying to investigate whether people who drink lots of orange juice have fewer colds. If you were doing this with an observational study, you might just survey a bunch of people and ask them how much orange juice they drink and how many colds they'd had during the past year, or how many days in the past year they'd been sick with a cold, and see if there was some relationship there. The problem with that is, if it turns out that people who drink a lot of orange juice have fewer colds than people who don't, maybe it's because of the drinking the orange juice, or maybe it's because of some other factor. Maybe people who drink a lot of orange juice also tend to do other things that make them healthier. Maybe they drink less soda. Maybe they are generally more health conscious and they do other things like eating lots of fruits and vegetables. Maybe they are wealthier and they can afford to drink lots of orange juice, and they can also afford to do other things that help them stay healthy. So that's one big drawback with an observational study. You can't really control for other complicating, confounding variables. In an experimental study, if you are taking that approach, you might get a bunch of volunteers and randomly divide them up into two different groups. And then have one group tell them, hey, drink 8 ounces of orange juice each day. And the other group tell them, don't drink any orange juice, but other than that, just do what you normally do. And then at the end of several months, however long your study is, then count the number of colds that people had in each group and see if there's a difference. So here's one example of an experimental study that I read about a few years ago in one of the online blogs at the Psychology Today website. And this was about a study someone did about the relationship between truth-telling and physical health. So as this person described it, they got 72 healthy adults recruited through newspapers in the South Bend, Indiana community. They were randomly assigned to two groups, a sincerity group and a control group. Both groups came to the laboratory each week for 5 weeks to complete polygraph tests and anonymous health measures. And here's the difference between the two groups. Members of the sincerity group, but not of the control group, were also told, throughout every day of the next 5 weeks, you must speak honestly, truthfully, and sincerely, not only about the big things, but also about the small things, such as why you were late. You must always mean what you say in situations where your statements are to be taken seriously, as opposed to when joking or obviously exaggerating. While you certainly can choose not to answer questions, you must always mean what you say. And then it says that in the 5th and final week of the study, the sincerity group reported significantly fewer physical health complaints than the control group. They experienced an average of 7 fewer symptoms, such as sore throats, headaches, and nausea that week. Because the only difference between the two groups was the sincerity instructions, we can conclude that these instructions actually caused the health benefit. Now, there may be room for some skepticism about the results of this study. Maybe if they did it with a different group or different kinds of people, they might have gotten different results. But in general, it's a pretty good example of an experimental as opposed to just an observational study. The variables in a study, when you're trying to study the relationship between two different variables, things that can vary from one person to another, you have your independent variable and your dependent variable. So the independent variable in a study is the one that you can manipulate or try different values for. If you're studying the relationship between drinking orange juice and how many colds people have, in that study that I was talking about, the independent variable would be how much orange juice people drank, or whether or not they drank orange juice every day. And then the dependent variable is the outcome or result, the one that you think might be affected by the independent variable. So if there really is a relationship, it might mean that the dependent variable depends on the other one. So if the number of colds that a person gets or how healthy a person is depends on how much orange juice they drink, then their health is the dependent variable, or the number of colds, or however you measure it, and then the drinking of the orange juice was the independent variable. In that study I was talking about here, the independent variable was whether or not people were instructed to always be truthful. They were divided into two groups. In one group, the people were given those instructions. In the other group, they weren't. So which group somebody was in, or whether or not they were told to always be truthful, that's the independent variable in that study. And then the dependent variable would be the number of physical health complaints that they reported, the number of symptoms they had, like headaches or nausea. So if that really did depend on which group they were in or whether or not they were always truthful, then we can say, oh, there's a relationship there. This depends on that. So you got your independent variable, you got your dependent variable, and there may also be confounding variables that influence the dependent variable, but were not separated from the independent variable. I already mentioned one example of that in my orange juice example. What if people who drink more orange juice also do more of other things or have other characteristics that influence how healthy they are? Here's one example I ran across of confounding variables. They did a survey back in 1947 of lawyers in Chicago. And back in those days, you didn't absolutely have to have a college degree to be a lawyer. After all, Abraham Lincoln, well, that was longer ago than 1947, but he was a lawyer and he never went to college. He was mostly self-taught. He studied law on his own and learned enough to become a lawyer. And so it used to be that you used to be able to become a lawyer without having graduated from college. And back in 1947, when they did this survey, they found that some of the lawyers who were practicing in Chicago had college degrees and some didn't. And of the ones with college degrees, their average annual income was $11,373, which doesn't sound like much today, but that was pretty good back in those days. But the ones without college degrees had an average annual income of $12,095. So what it looks like here is, hey, the lawyers without college degrees were earning more money. They had higher income on the average than the lawyers with college degrees. What's going on here? Does getting a college degree actually make you earn less money? Is the amount of income that a lawyer earns dependent on whether or not they went to college in a negative way? Well, there's a confounding variable here. I said that in those days you could be a lawyer without a college degree, but it was becoming less common. So the lawyers who didn't have college degrees tended to be the older lawyers who had been in practice for a long time. So they had gotten a lot of experience, they had built up a big client base, and that's why they were earning more money. The ones with college degrees, on the average, tended to be the younger lawyers, the ones who were new at the business, hadn't been at it as long, and that's the reason why they weren't making as much money. It wasn't because they had college degrees, but it was because they hadn't been in the business as long. And so that confounding variable, which was related to both of these other variables, kind of explains the difference.